Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us. Next week, we commemorate Juneteenth. Although Colonial Williamsburg is known mostly for 18th century history, we believe it is important to understand our complete American history. So today, we want to talk about the institution of slavery, the people who lived with that system, and how it changed over time. We'll be taking your questions in just a bit. But for now, let's introduce our guests. Please introduce yourselves, tell us why you're here talking about this today, and why it's important to you.
Good afternoon. My name is Janice Canaday. I am the supervisor of the Peyton Randolph House here at Colonial Williamsburg. I've been with the foundation for about 26 years in some way, shape, or form, but in the last 12 years I've been an interpreter for school and groups where I led tours for children from kindergarten to college and beyond. But presently I am the supervisor of the Peyton Randolph House, and today I'm here to engage in a discussion about slavery and the law and how it changes over time.
My name is Dr. Kelly Brennan Arehart. I'm one of the historians here at Colonial Williamsburg. I've worked for Colonial Williamsburg in some form or fashion for about 10 years. And my reason to be here is something that I say to interpretive staff, and never really sounds good, but I'm going to say it anyway. I'm not here to make you feel good. My job as a historian is to make sure that our staff has accurate information, that they can make thoughtful conclusions as they read them. So I'm here because it's not my job to make you feel good.
Last year, in 2019, we commemorated the 400th anniversary of the 1619 arrival of a group of African people to Virginia. What do we know about the experiences of the Africans that arrived to the English colony of Virginia in the 17th century?
It's a great question, and it's so frustrating because the answer is not very much. This is always a problem when you're talking about the history of slavery. There isn't that much recorded, and what's recorded is by usually the owners and the people in power. We do know, and what they do during the period, especially in the first half of the 18th century, they use language like servant in the law. And we say servant, it actually is a catch-all for a group of people, and it's not a euphemism. It's not trying to be polite, as we used to do when talking about slavery. It is Afro-Virginians, it is indentures, and convict indentures as well. And you see through the first half of the century, they're always lumped together. But as you get to about 1640, 1650, you see that the black population and the white population are being talked about separately. And then we get to 1662, which is where we have sort of our biggest moment here in Virginia with the condition of the child being tied to the condition of the mother. So if the mother is owned and enslaved, so is that child. And that's where we're beginning to see things begin to coalesce. You see laws that cut people down more and more in the 1660s through about the 1680s. And it's restrictions. It's restrictions on gathering. It's restrictions on, actually, I should say in general, and I'll kick this over to you, that it's basically they begin to restrict life.
Everything about their person is going to be restricted. Relationships, community, family, little simple things, what they can have, what they can't have, their relationship with their children if they have children, their relationship with their spouse or a husband or a mate if they choose to have one. Everything about their humanity is going to be upset and changed and altered by the laws that are going to be written. And all those things started to change when they came across the ocean. From the very onset when they were taken from their villages and marched through the forest and kept in the dungeons or in the prisons before they were taken across the ocean, everything about their lives changed. And even though we don't know whether they were assessed to be indentured servants or a servant, when they came to these shores, we know when they left the continent of Africa, they were someone's mother or father or child. And so when we're talking about these laws, it's important to understand the wording. But I think with what's going on in our world today, what's more impactful is to understand the humanity that was always present but always overlooked.
So moving into the 18th century, why is Williamsburg important to the story of enslaved and free black people during that time?
I think this is it's such an interesting question given the fact that, people have been saying, oh, we don't need Colonial Williamsburg, destroy Colonial Williamsburg. This is literally where it started. One, this is not literally where it started, but something even more important happened here. And that is the idea that they refine and refine over years. 1705, you begin to see an omnibus law that's beginning to restrict people more. 1723, they double down every opportunity they can, and they didn't have to do that. And it isn't until we see a meaningful manumission law, meaning a law that makes it so owners can free enslaved people, until 1782, and that's not here, that's in Richmond.
It's funny, the laws are reactionary. And so if you study the laws or go through the little timeline, you can see that they are starting to be written based on the reactions of the people that they're writing the laws for. And it's important to always know the laws were not written to protect those who are oppressed or enslaved. They were written to control them. The laws were written to protect the owners of that chattel property.
And that's what makes enslavement, as a topic to study, one, fascinating and important, but two, almost unwieldy at times. Because the thing is, we think of, as modern Americans, we think of one vision of what enslavement was like. And what it usually is, it's 19th century and it's deep south. And it ignores a whole bunch of very important groups of people in different times. So for example, we get a lot of our laws from out of the Barbados slave codes that's passed in 1661. Now, we don't take the whole thing, and that's the thing that I think is important about that idea of doubling down, is they take bits of it at a time. And they take it through the 1660s, and actually some of the stuff shows up in the 19th century. So slavery in Barbados is very, very different. It's violent. The process of making sugar is so dangerous. Okay, so you got one set. And we're going to use, move to another set, let's say, New Jersey. New Jersey grows cash crops, which they grow wheat, which is very labor intensive, which means they have a big enslaved population. They don't pass their manumission laws, the idea of laws where they can free people, or abolition laws, I should say. 1820 is the latest law. There's, I think it's 1807 before that, but clearly it's not working, and they're trying to figure out a way to do this. So what you see is that in every place you have enslavement, and that's talking, Boston is 20% enslaved at the time of the Revolution, New York is 10%. What you see is exactly what you were saying. It's reactionary. The people who are in power make the laws and make it suit whatever and at least initially it's economic circumstance.
They custom fit the laws to fit their agenda and to create and support that institution. Absolutely. And to affect the economy or the economic wealth they want to bring about, whether it's agricultural, whether it's going to be industrial, whatever. Yeah. The law is always going to change according to the climate of the times that they're living in and what they're trying to produce and bring about.
So, Kelly, you mentioned several specific laws and when they changed, but one you mentioned specifically came out of Richmond in 1782. Could you speak a little more about what exactly changed in Virginia in 1782?
Basically freeing enslaved people and individuals own enslaved people becomes easier, because before this point the laws are really strict. I think there's one in the 1690s. There's one in the 1690s that says you can free enslaved people that you own. They got to be out of the colony in 6 months.
6 months.
And then the owner has to pay for it. Like, who's going to agree to that?
Exactly. So even if that owner was thinking about doing it, at what cost to him? And is he willing to pay that price? Exactly.
And then you get to the 1723 law, where an enslaved person can be freed if they go to, if it's presented to the governor's council, and they make their decision based on meritorious service. Well, who assesses that? Well, of course, the people who are going to be the ones who grant the freedom.
Mm-hmm. And so you're talking about maybe telling about a possible slave insurrection that's being plotted by those who are part of your family or community, maybe saving your master or mistress from hurt, harm, or danger, or coming up with a cure, which these people did all those things. However, if the law says they own you, they own all that you make manifest, whether it's your work or whatever. So when you think about it, again, what price are they paying for this freedom? And when you were talking about the law in the beginning in the 1690s, when it wasn't so much a government approval that you need to manumit your property, well, if the law says that the owners can manumit you, but they have to pay for you, and then you have to be out of here within 6 months. What if you have a family here? And you usually do. So who wants their freedom without their children? Where are you going to go? What kind of freedom is that?
And I think that's exactly the point, right?
Mm-hmm.
They're making it hard on the owner, they're making it hard on the enslaved person.
Exactly.
So it's from 1723 till 1782. That's the way enslaved people had to be freed. And now remember, 1782 is not like, it's abolition and it's done. But what happens is owners then have the ability to free their own enslaved people as long as it's in writing and goes through the court system. This is a huge deal, and it's weird because it's this little blip in the history of Virginia's slave law. Because very quickly they turn back around and the laws begin to get tightened up as we move into the 19th century.
Well, in the 19th century, things are changing. Mm-hmm. The crops, what we're doing, we're getting towards sugar and all those. The heavy-duty crops require a lot of labor. It's labor-intensive, and it's also very dangerous. Mm-hmm. And so they'll find out or realize it's easier to replace people than to protect or maintain those people. Mm-hmm. And so when the crops start to shift here, what are we doing? We're shifting people down south. And so again, families are in danger of being split apart. People sold away from each other, and so their whole lives have been turned over again.
We will open the floor up to audience questions in just a moment. So please, if you have questions, post them in the comments sections, and Kelly and Janice will be answering them for you. But you started to get into the 19th century and how things changed. So let's talk a little bit about that. What are some of the changes that happened to the institution of slavery in the 19th century, and what were the reasons behind those changes?
And as Janice has started talking about that idea that people are moving into different areas, crops are changing, that is going to be part of that story. Because it goes back to what we were talking about earlier, the idea of the people in power make it look the way they need it. So there's that element. We're getting into the deep south. Well, I will say here, a number of things happen here in Virginia that begin to influence and impact the way other places are thinking about enslavement, and it's not for the better. In 1800, Gabriel, something called Gabriel's Rebellion. He was an enslaved man. He was a blacksmith, and he basically collected a group of other people, free and enslaved blacks, and the plan was actually to march on Richmond. That was the initial plan. So that happens in 1800. He's hanged in October of 1800. You want to know when the first restrictive slave laws tied to the rebellion were passed? In either January or February. You're talking about a group of gentry men who don't move fast for anything. And all of a sudden, when something happens, these laws get passed real fast. And what happens is they build on some of the old ones. One of the things that begins to come up, and I'm pretty sure it's Gabriel's Rebellion, that enslaved people who are basically convicted of a felony, yes, they can be executed, but they can also be sold to someone who will take them out of the colony. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So, because one, the value, and two, it's everything you've been saying, it's going to destroy people.
Exactly. You know, the population has doubled in a way that they probably didn't even expect. You have to worry about being able to control that population, so they tighten down the laws. The laws become more violent. The way they deal with people when they run away or possibly planning insurrections or revolts. It's something that they have to get a quick control on, get a handle on it and really control it. And so they do that through the law.
Mm-hmm. And it's the easiest, most efficient way for them because they are the lawmakers.
That's when you've got people being made example of.
Mm-hmm.
I hate to say, in certain places and spaces, the law will allow them to execute people and chop off or cut off their heads and put them on pikes for the community to see. This is what will be done to you if you don't adhere to these laws and restrictions.
Yeah, I mean, and what they actually do, part of this is there's a legal part that actually helps push this forward, is the part about slave patrols. Mm-hmm. So what happens after Gabriel and certainly after Nat Turner's rebellion, it becomes easier for an authority, not a group of authority, one person, one justice of the peace, to call for, to call for a slave patrol. They couldn't do that before. Mm-hmm. And in some laws, as they begin to progress, in some places, not everywhere, it becomes, men of a certain quality, meaning white and have at least some money, they can make the decision, all right, we're going to go out. There's not even the law involved.
No, so they play willy-nilly with the law. And they do exactly what they want when they want.
Well, that leads us very well into our first question from the audience. Aaron has asked us, what happened if somebody did break the law?
That's a good question. And the thing I will say, it depends on where and when. Because, what they were doing in Barbados and what they were doing in Virginia are different. But here in Virginia, we can talk about what they were doing here in Virginia. It also depends on the crime. It's in that sense, it's the crime. Mm-hmm.
It's an open-ended question, really. It just depends on the circumstance. But we do know if you're enslaved, the law is going to be dealt to you in a different way. All types of people break the law. The same law is going to be looked at from a different perspective, depending on who you are in your place or not in society.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly what it is. It's going to depend on that. But the thing is, I find that question, Aaron, about what happens if you get punished, fascinating, or get caught or whatever, convicted of a crime. Because the thing is, they do get taken to court. Now, if they commit a felony, they don't go to the High Court of Virginia, which is what happens with free people, but they go to court and they're tried. Earlier on, they do have a jury. As time passed, that gets taken away. But there's some things that make it very difficult. They cannot defend themselves because they cannot testify, which they wouldn't really do much anyway. It's the whole, or another person. So we have instances where the enslaved people knew exactly what happened, that the person wasn't brought to justice or made free because of this.
They witnessed situations and could testify. But they're not considered credible witnesses because of who they are. Mm-hmm. No slave, Negro, mulatto, musty, Native American, or Indian could raise their hand and testify against a white. Mm-hmm. And their word is not credible without the testimony of a white person.
Mm-hmm. Anne Marie has asked, can you tell us about those brave women who sued for their freedom in the 17th century prior to the chattel slave law?
You probably know a little more about that than I know.
Well, I don't know more, but I know about one in my own family.
Even better.
In 1694, and her name was Elizabeth Meekins. And she sued in the York County Court for her freedom and that of her teenage son. I don't know the outcome because I haven't found it yet. But I tend to think about women like Mary Aggie in 1728 who's suing for her freedom, not knowing that there were women, enslaved women, and other women before then taking on the law, using the law, that they're aware of what's going on. And they know the law is not written for them, but they're trying to operate within the law established to, one, use it to better themselves, and two, show people around them that I'm willing to adhere and act as though a citizen would, even though you don't give me the same rights or the same privileges as other people here in the society. So they're showing folks that they know how to use the law for their advantage as well, and they're presenting petitions to the court. We know that Matthew Ashby went to the court for his wife and for other women who were enslaved to make sure, or to ensure, that maybe they would adjust the law so that when these women have to pay taxes on themselves and their property, that they would be treated as the white women in society as well. So yes, there are a number of women and other people that are using the law in their favor.
I think that's a really important point, because it's that idea of what counts as resistance and being able to manipulate law. I mean, guys at the top do it. Why can't why can't everybody else? And when they do that, they create these almost absurd in some situations, just because they're so unusual, circumstances where they can really operate. I mean, I think the example of Matthew Ashby, who was free, was married to an enslaved woman. They had children. He purchased his wife and his kids, but if he died and had debt, that meant his wife and his children would be sold away from him. So he went through the process. You want to talk a little bit about the process?
Well, Matthew Ashby had to raise 150 pounds, which is a lot of money. When we think about this time period, that's probably maybe 3 or 4 years worth of a tradesperson's salary. And so I'm sure that his wife's owner knew that it was a really large amount and probably never expected him to be able to raise that amount of money. But have you ever had to buy your family before? And so with determination, this man went out and did what he had to. He came up with the money. He took it and had it placed on the books at Mr. Prince's store, I believe it is. But he also had to present a petition to the court afterwards, general court, to ask him to fully manumit his family. And he didn't take that paper there on his own. He asked the president of the Governor's Council, which is John Blair, to do it for him, feeling that he might have more of an edge at getting the success that he wanted. And so this man was hooked up, and he used his connections within the community of powerful people. He established a relationship. And in the end, he did get what he wanted, because about a year or so after his family had been purchased, he'd purchased them, which made them his property. And after he presented that petition, after about a year, he passed away.
Cheryl Ann has asked, how much control did the imperial government have over slave law? Were most of the laws colonial laws?
That's a great question. And it's one of those things that when you go back and look, the British Empire doesn't talk about it very much. I mean, it does come up on occasion, but it's not like one of these things that's regulated by the government. It's one of these things that it's not regulated by the government. So what happens is we get into the thing we were talking about earlier. So it's customizable because there's not a lot of top-down when it comes to this stuff. So you've got these groups of men who are tremendously powerful, in part because it doesn't mean anything to the empire to spend all their time in this. They do have really strict rules eventually with trading with the Dutch, and one of the major things they would trade with the Dutch were enslaved people. But that came out of like Anglo-Dutch War. So there was regulation, but particularly on the international slave trade, I would argue, more than anything else. Yeah.
You mentioned a bit about this, but was there any protest or rebellion here in Williamsburg?
There are always small pockets of rebellion. Because they didn't print it in the papers or talk about it, doesn't mean it wasn't going on, but they didn't intend for it to be talked about or publicized because of how they wanted to present Williamsburg and their ability to control that human property. We can do this, you can do this. This is quite a system. Come on and join in the fun, so to speak. But that was not the case. Whether people were resisting on farms and plantations where they're deciding not to work, or they're breaking the tools, or they're running off, every day someone was resisting in their own way. Everybody doesn't react the same way, but they did what worked for them.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent, and that's the perfect way to put it. And I think that's one of these things, so many enslaved people's stories are just lost to history. Mm-hmm. So we don't know the details about how some of these pieces work. But at the same time, given their innate humanity, the opportunities where you can take them, resisting where you can, we get to get a little bit that reconstitute, I guess would say. And I don't like to say it that way, but because so many stories are missing, it becomes a way to talk about all kinds of elements, I should say.
But a good way to know that they are doing just that is look at the laws, because the laws are changing as these situations are coming about. So it's like I said, it's a reactionary thing.
As we mentioned earlier, next week we commemorate Juneteenth. And one of the reasons we wanted to have this program today is for something that you mentioned earlier. People in the United States seem to be more familiar with what the institution of slavery looked like at the time right before emancipation. Why is it that you think people are more familiar with what slavery looked like in the 19th century than in earlier time periods?
I think it has to do with just modern culture. I think it's the fact that that's the part people associate, right? Because the most important part of the history of Black Americans, apparently, is just that moment in 1865, and we know that's not true. That's the immediate lead up, and I think that's why. The story is intense, and I think part of it is cultural storytellers, for a variety of reasons, have latched onto that piece. And I think that's why. I think because in each century, the nature of slavery is different, not only here, but in all the other places as well. It's hard. That's a hard, long narrative to hold on to, because there's all these really subtle things, right? Some of these laws, it looks like, oh, it's just this itty bitty thing, and it's not. But it's not as exciting as watching, certain types of, movies that address slavery or address slavery, right?
It's more written about. Who's right? Who's telling the story? The folks who were in the times before then. How many had the ability to really write about the story? Everything was being talked about from ear to ear. Folks who thought about it, some wrote, we know that, maybe more than we actually have account for. But people really found their voice and put pen to paper and were more able to in the 1800s and coming forward. Because there were more folks daring to teach. I'll teach you what I know. I'll teach you how to put pen to paper, how to write. And I think over time, as we get the seasoning of seeing what's going on, people were getting sick and tired then, like they're sick and tired now. And so they start to use their voice and use whatever agency they had, and they dared to live. It might cost me, and that's true today. It might cost me to speak out, but I'm going to speak out, not so much for me, but for the generations to come. So it was that selflessness and that determination that kind of woke up and took root. And
the thing too about, so you're beginning to hear more Black voices, and then in the North, you have these people who are very, very, well, not everybody obviously, but there's enough of a push, which means, if it's written by the victors, and of course, formerly enslaved people aren't quite, as we know, victors, but so if it's written by the North and they have this tinge, let me tell you how horrible the South is. And it's not necessarily that they were wrong. It's that it's like any primary source, we talk about this all the time, you have to look at who's writing it and what their agenda is. Like I said, I'm not saying that it was good in the South. I mean, I know, I am actually a 19th centuryist, is my background. I know it's not. But the way the story comes out sometimes, especially when you're not amplifying the Black voices,
it's
really.
different. Yeah, just different.
Yeah.
So we have talked a lot about the change in the law and some of the larger cultural changes, but fundamentally for enslaved people, what were some of the main changes in life over this time period that we've been talking about today? This everyday life experience.
And it's funny, this is another one where location and time really makes a difference. What you begin to see as you get into the 19th century, you have more enslaved people, and this is true across the South, more enslaved people owned by one person. And then most white people who owned slaves had one or two. So the likelihood as an enslaved person was you were in one of these, 500 people plus plantations, where if you're talking about a white person or an enslaved person owned by a white person who's doesn't have much money, it's a very different experience. But that's becoming more common when we get into the 19th century. So that's a big change.
I was going to say the same thing. Yeah.
Sorry.
No problem.
Well, that is all the time that we have today for questions. So did you have any last remarks that you would like to make with our audience before we end our program today?
Just want to say that part of the reason that we're talking about the laws and slavery, slavery is that big stain, that really big stain on this country's, this nation's beginning. And we all know that, and we have to recognize that. And even though Juneteenth is coming up and people were emancipated, and even after that, there was some time before some folks even knew that that had even happened, depending on where they were and how the news traveled and how generous their owner was with the news, because it wasn't advantageous for them. But those people still had quite a ways to go even then, and had to figure out what they were going to do and how they were going to do it, with people still putting laws together at that time that were going to restrict them and marginalize them in an even greater fashion as they try to move forward on their own. But when you look at the legacies of slavery and the laws that were written back in that time period, and look at what's going on in our world today, that fight is very real. That struggle is still here. There's still people who are jumping up pockets of rebellion, but today, because of social media, we are so aware, and it's such a visual thing to see people by the thousands going across bridges and walking down highways and taking over cities and taking their signs. Children, mothers, fathers, everybody still protesting, still screaming to have those same rights that those founding fathers, those ideals that were in those documents, they're still trying to hold those people to accountability. When we talk about the Independence Day that's coming, it's great to talk about independence, but independence for who? Whose independence is it? Because you have that small faction of people that are called the minorities, but they're big in number really, who are wanting to be seen as a whole human being and live their lives. They've been told to pull themselves up by the bootstraps. Sometimes you don't even have bootstraps. But if you look through your history, when the law allowed them, when they were able to work within the law, they found ways to build communities and businesses. And then something came along and tore those things down and ripped it away from them. And they're tired of starting over and over and over again. So please, with a different scope, look at the laws written then and now by those who are in power. Open your ears and listen to the voices of the people who are crying out to you. Folks are not trying to tear up anything. They just want to live. So think about what it would be for you to be in the same places and spaces that you're creating for those people with the laws that you write. So even if you're not writing it, when you go to the polls, who are you voting for? What are you supporting? So make your voice count.
Absolutely. I'm so glad that you said that about look to the law, because what I was actually going to say actually builds on that, which is look to the courts. Who has access to the courts? Who's treated fairly in front of a court? And you can do this for almost any period of time, anywhere, and you'll know who's oppressed within a society right away. And I would say the one thing I would want everyone to take away is we need you to know more than slavery is bad. We want you to understand its nuances, its moments of terror, and that everything is not the same. Slavery is not a monolith. I think with that, I want to thank you so much for joining us today. Next week is the Juneteenth celebration. It will be on this time, same bat channel. Yeah. Thank you. Okay. Thank you. I was just like, shut.